Hi, everybody. I'm here hanging out on the back deck with Tracy once again.
Hi, everyone.
And I was just chatting about something that I think is really worth consideration for those of us who've been following the UFO subject for any period of time, which is, I was just saying to Tracy, are we potentially at the end of the UFO era? And what I mean by that is, if this were the 1940s or 1930s or 1950s or, many years ago, and you were to see an unusual aerial object, you would be much more likely to be puzzled by whatever that thing was, because you would know, A, there's not a whole lot of aerial traffic up in the sky back in those days. B, the aerial traffic that existed was very straightforward, certain kinds of planes and things in the air, but if you saw something that looked unusual, that behaved in an unusual way, that would get your attention. And that was the primary means by which we would gather evidence of non-humans among us. That is, unusual aerial phenomena was absolutely, without question, the number one form of evidence that people have used for years and years and years to hypothesize that there are other beings here. And it makes sense, because if you, again, see an object that we don't know how to explain, presumably it's technology that's beyond our capability and so forth. And so we infer that this is representative of other types of beings. Probably true. Like, I think that there's absolutely good reasons why we look at UFOs and connect it to non-human intelligences. But here's the thing. Tracy and I were talking just in our last Off the Cuff about, you mentioned drones, and how we're moving into an era of ubiquitous, universal drones that will be potentially, at least, and flying cars and all other kinds of things that will be up there. And it just may become more and more difficult to use unusual aerial phenomena as the main source of evidence to argue for the existence of aliens here. And this is something I've wondered before, but I'm just bringing it up again. Like, are there other forms of evidence we could be looking at? And the answer is absolutely yes. So if we hypothesize that there are other beings walking among us, that would potentially be an important form of evidence, clearly, for humans living among us. Now, how to determine that, how to test people for that, all of those are difficulties. I don't know how to surmount any of that. But the point is that would be a form of evidence separate from unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified flying objects. And other forms of evidence, implants, for example, would be another thing to look at. But when you really get down to it, like looking for evidence of non-humans among us, then of course there's abduction experiences and personal encounters. We should not forget that. That remains very important. There are large numbers of people who have vivid memories of being taken by non-humans. A lot of those folks are members of our site. And a lot of them are not members of our site. There's many people out there. So there are ways to look at this, but it's really conceivable that as time goes by, the evidence provided by UFOs or UAP for connecting that to alien life forms or secret civilizations even, it's going to be potentially much more difficult for us to work with. And what that portends for UFO research is a really good question. Where will UFO research be in, say, 20 years? If you look at current developments in the trajectory of our own aerial technology, it could be virtually impossible to do good UFO analysis if you're looking at, some of the potential advanced aerial craft that are likely to be coming off, production assembly in the next couple of decades. I mean, very different from 20 years ago, where, we're still roughly in the same era that we were 20 years ago in terms of aerial tech. We have, there's more potential craft that are out there. There's drones, but it's not really qualitatively different. But 20 years from now, it's entirely possible that we're going to be in a qualitatively different era in terms of the aerial objects that are out there. And if that's so, I don't know, we may have means of detecting anomalies in the future, but maybe they won't be practical. Maybe it won't be easy. So I'm just thinking, the era of UFO analysis and investigation may be going through some significant changes in the coming years. It's just a thought. You and I were kind of talking about this a little bit the other day, but it just makes you wonder where we're all going to be. I don't know if I have much more beyond that right now. You were thinking I had more to say.
Yeah, I have some other thoughts, but we'll pause this and come back. I'm going to tell you.
Okay, we just actually took a very quick pause. You can't really tell that.
No, and I wanted to remind Richard of something interesting that just happened because, of course, it piqued my interest.
Well, yeah, I mean, what are some of the directions that UFO research or alien research is going to go moving forward? And again, I don't know that it's really going to be an ongoing analysis of aerial objects. I think that may continue to be part of the mix, but for example, I mean, we get emails all the time from people who've got claims that are very interesting. And whether or not these can all be proven is another question. But just for instance, not long ago, another individual just told me about an encounter that they had with a potential military, I don't want to say whistleblower, because this was someone who I don't think was trying to be a whistleblower, but someone who had information. And it was very, we're going to keep looking into this and see if we can determine anything from it. But essentially, secret bases, alien, long-term alien presence, all of those things were implied in this particular bit of information.
And a little bit about the contents of the secret bases.
Well,
which is extremely interesting to me and will be to people.
I guess
if you can talk about it.
Well, I'm going to try to, but it's intriguing. I guess we'll just say that, like the quality of the individual who wrote to us and their assessment of this individual, I think at least makes me think, all right, let's pursue this. And I'm sorry I'm being so vague here, everybody, but the point that I'm trying to make is simply that.
Hey, good. How are you?
Just pause again. We had a neighbor just saying, hey. How's it going, Lucky?
Hey, you too.
And that type of information, I think, comes periodically, and it's definitely worth looking into. I mean, the thing is, one thing you can definitely foresee for the coming years is a need for greater military transparency relating to UFOs in general. There's no question that the militaries of the world, and first and foremost the military of the United States, has had substantial encounters with these unknown objects and phenomena. So we're back to UFOs here, but in the sense of getting government transparency and openness about the UFO phenomenon is definitely a key way that I think we need to be moving forward with this. So it's not that civilian UFO sightings become useless. I don't think that they do, but I think much more significant is the need to get true government and declassification of a lot of these UFO, UAP encounters. That brings you to the things that the Senate are doing now, the Senate Intelligence Committee, talking about having a UAP task force, and whether that will actually be useful or not, we'll have to see in the future. But the idea of a UAP task force actually is a really good idea, if for no other reason than it could be a very important wedge by which to pry open some information, even if it's not the most classified information. I think that moving forward, I mean, think of it this way. How many big contemporary UFO sightings have there been?
Right.
The answer is basically none, or practically none. I mean, there was the Maje, Brazil, alleged crash retrieval of something that happened earlier this year, and I don't know what the status of that is, but really in terms of contemporary, like 2020, 2019 UFO sightings that have really gripped our imagination, they're being reported all the time by MUFON and the National UFO Reporting Center, but none have really captured the imagination of the world. So it doesn't mean that they're not happening, but somehow we are not, as a society, making much of them, and maybe because it's difficult to. I don't know. But I do know that getting data out of the government could be a fruitful way to move forward over the next number of years, and that could include leaks, both legal and otherwise. Information comes out any which way, and it's entirely possible that there will be digital leaks coming out in the years to come. I mean, we're in that kind of an era where things like that can happen. I guess what I'm really wondering about is, moving forward in our society, what forms of evidence will we be able to gather of anomalies in our civilization? Maybe that's the basic thing we want to be looking for, rather than asking about the evidence of unknown aerial objects, which is part of the whole array of evidence.
Yeah.
But there's more than that. So I don't know if I've got this very well thought out at this point, but I think it's something it's interesting to think about moving forward, because I don't think there's any question, like, what constituted UFO investigation in the 50s or 60s in some ways would be quite different than how we would investigate UFOs today. I think it's much more confusing today. So there have got to be other forms of evidence we want to be looking for. I mentioned implants, maybe, I don't know how you do genetic study of human-looking non-humans. I have no idea how that would even work, if that's even possible.
Right.
We can still be looking at anomalies, for example, beyond Earth orbit in space, if it's possible for us to get eyes out there. And of course, with the soon-to-be heavy commercialization of space, like, how's that all going to work out? Will there be any liberty and leeway at all in the corporatized elements of space to allow for genuine investigation of anomalies out there? And the answer may be no. Elon Musk or Robert Bigelow or any other contractor that's able to get out in space with a whatever kind of contract, at least for the time being, it may be that they can't do much of anything without getting security clearances. And if they get a security clearance, then they're not really going to be presumably at much liberty to be discussing or investigating anomalies. Even if you're Robert Bigelow, who obviously is very interested in this whole subject. That's, I think, very clear. But in theory, there could be independent investigators who might be able to learn something about space anomalies as our capabilities move forward. It's entirely possible. And maybe that would be a next generation UFO research capability. If you get some good tech in if we're able to get, for example, high altitude drones out by the public. I don't know if that would be possible or legal. But the better visibility you have up in the sky, presumably the better chance you're going to have of capturing bizarre things that are up there. All this makes me appreciate even more the value of good historical UFO analysis. It just makes it obvious the more you look at the long history of these sightings, going back through the years, it's critical to do a good job in assessing those because we have a much better idea of what technologies were supposed to be available in the 40s and in the 50s than we do about tech today. So for that reason, I'm really glad that myself and other people have done good historical analysis of early UFO sightings, and that's definitely helpful for us. But again, moving this forward, we're just going to have to be creative and recognize the fact that standard UFO investigations and analyses, the kinds that you get with organizations like MUFON, I just wonder, does this make sense to you as well? I just wonder how valuable in the coming years those are going to be. I could be proven wrong. If there's a major sighting that occurs that we're just unable to explain in any prosaic way, absolutely. It's just that I don't see these types of sightings happening. I don't see major events in terms of UFOs grabbing the public imagination and attention. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were UFO sightings that were current at the time and did get a lot of public attention. In the 1970s as well, in the 80s and 90s, as a matter of fact. And it really stopped. It started to decline. There was some in the 21st century. There was Stevensville, Texas, back in 2008. There was the Chicago O'Hare sighting at the airport in 2006. So there have been. But even those are more than a decade old. And there's just not a whole great many of these new sightings that are getting a lot of attention. So, again, in terms of figuring this out, I think transparency in the classified world is going to continue to be an important prong of research, it seems to me. And also, and this is always trickier, but it still has to be considered, like inside leaks, information coming from alleged witnesses who all have to be vetted. Obviously, they've got to be investigated to the best extent possible. But it does seem to me that that's an avenue of evidence that is going to continue to be worth considering. These questions become particularly interesting when you consider if there is an alien agenda or agendas going on, which there certainly appears to be, then what really should our priorities be in terms of this phenomenon? And it really depends on, I suppose, what your conclusion is about the nature of that agenda or plural agendas. So because I'm thinking about this too, because I'm actually nearly done transcribing and editing my lecture of alien agendas, which I gave a couple of months ago. And I've just been thinking about this again. And there could be some definite urgency going on to whatever it is happening if you are either looking at Dave Jacobs' thesis of hybrid infiltration in our society, or some of the things that we've been talking about on our site, which is simply some other form of human-looking infiltration of the global power structure. And if that is the case, whether it's through something like Jacobs is imagining or some other system that's happening, nonetheless, you could argue that there would be some urgency to us figuring this out. On top of that, we are in the midst of a massive civilizational and species-wide transformation. Something I've been talking about this year quite a bit. We are in it, and the whole COVID pandemic, plandemic, whatever response to this is accelerating it. That is, we're moving to a completely new and very controlled phase of human existence. And how that's going to factor into all of this is something else we've got to think about. In other words, the movement toward, let's say, cashless society, so all transactions that you make in your life are completely trackable. Universal basic income is definitely coming along. All forms of control, social control in every way imaginable is being ramped up. In terms of, you can see it in social distancing laws. You can see it in Australia right now is going crazy, like arresting people for not wearing masks or going on Facebook and telling people not to wear masks. It's insane. That's just one example. You see this heavy-handed, excessive digitalization of control that's happening all around us. And it gives us all this sense that time is short. Whatever is going on, whatever is happening, I don't know that we have a whole lot of time to get our act together to deal with it while we actually still have some ability to leverage, if we have any ability actually as a public, to leverage information out of our governments relating to any kind of ET/alien presence here on planet Earth. And I'm changing gears here ever so slightly, but it looks to me that the road to disclosure, I've been really thinking this for some time now, may be slowing down. It may not pick up. We may be at a new standstill for the next coming period of time. It could be for another 5 years that we don't move any farther ahead than we are right now. It could be that this is the case for 10 years. It's insane as it seems because we have actually moved a lot in our public conversation in 3 years. But what you can see is during those 3 years, there have been definite boundaries put in place as well, beyond which public conversation still is not going. And those boundaries include long-standing UFO cover-up questions. You've noticed over the last 3 years, there has not been any detailed examination in the mainstream, anyway, of the following question. If these objects are real, they are anomalous, then is there any legitimacy to the question of a UFO cover-up? Like, no one's asked that. I don't even know if George Knapp has gone that far in some of his reporting on this. And George is someone who's not averse to asking these questions. But then you go to even larger mainstream voices, and that's just not coming out anywhere. So there are definite limits to the extent of our public conversation on UFOs that have been very obviously in place since this whole thing started at the end of 2017. And, oh, by the way, Tracy's off in the garden while I'm riffing here. So that's why you're not hearing her. She's just looking at... We've got some butterflies and bees out there. It's really kind of nice. But back to that sense of urgency. It seems to me that it's entirely feasible that disclosure progress in the mainstream pauses. Doesn't have to reverse course, but it could conceivably pause right where it is, right where we are now, and not move for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, we see a continued consolidation of digital media, continued consolidation of the legal system globally to, as it were, congeal our ability to generate fresh information about this. In all likelihood, I would expect that there will be new developments that the people around the world can get in order to investigate this, but I just don't know what they are right now. I can only assume that there's going to be new technologies, new capabilities for us to communicate our research. I certainly hope that that is the case, and I can imagine. I can't visualize what it is. So all of these factors make me wonder what it is that's going to constitute genuine and fresh UFO research in the future. I mean the near future as well as the distant future. Here's something else to consider. In years past, when the United States government continually denied that there was any legitimacy to the idea of UFOs, one of the things that researchers did, it was really important, obviously, is to gather evidence that supported the reality of these anomalous objects. That's really, in a sense, all UFO researchers had to do for years and years, was simply to document and provide evidence for anomalous craft in the sky, things that could not be explained in any conventional sense. That's really all. That was the primary thing, it seems to me, that a good UFO researcher could do at that particular time, is simply gather good evidence, get a good airtight case, knowing that you aren't going to get the government to make an admission, but still knowing that you could get your information, your evidence out there to the public. You as a researcher could be part of that conversation to eventually one day shift public opinion. But now we're in an era in 2018, 2019, 2020, in which by various stages, the United States Navy, the Pentagon have made admissions. The New York Times, you have Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, just a month and a half ago now, in their article in the Times, stating it's okay to believe in UFOs. The evidence is overwhelming. In fact, they said it's beyond belief. It's now we're in the realm of knowledge. We know that this is real. So UFO researchers are still in a position where, if you get hold of a good sighting, you want to analyze it, you want to demonstrate that it's anomalous if it is. But that's not pardon me. That's not necessarily the single most critical determinant anymore, because we've got, in a sense, a tacit admission that this stuff is real. And so it begs the question, where now to genuine, I'm going to use this word literally, progressive UFO research? In other words, where does UFO progress to? Do we need to focus on the evidence of anomalous aircraft still? I would say there remains a place for that. It remains still an important piece of the overall picture, but I think there's no question we need to be looking at much more than that. And so the types of evidence become something we've got to really figure this out for a fresh foundation for the future of what we will call UFO research, but it's actually going to be much more than UFO research. So the research of non-human intelligences here on planet Earth that are interacting with us, that are a civilization that is not our own, essentially. So that's a whole, in other words, I guess what we're really talking about here is a reconception of UFO research into something more comprehensive. So I think, yes, that's the direction that UFO research is potentially able to go ahead into doing. Whether it's going to happen or whether it will just stall is really a good question. Right now, some of the fresh currents in ufology, it seems to me, are with some of the new journalists who are out there. A lot of these folks are pumping information out of TTSA, for example, the young guns. Some of these guys do really great work, and I support them fully. And then there's a variety of independent researchers around the world who are delving into document research and leaks. There's people around the world who are still quietly going deeper into the Eric Davis notes on his conversation with Thomas Wilson. That has not gone away. There are a whole array of areas where contemporary research can still be going to get information out. But I think down the road, it would be good for all of us, myself included, to think about a comprehensive system of research to be studying this. And in fact, this has been suggested on our site in the past. I think the time is, the time is getting right for those of us who care to think about a fresh approach to what we have called ufology for all these years. There's another thing that comes to mind, which is how possible will it be to engage the broader public on this subject anyway? You think about 2020. We've had so much critically important UFO news that has actually come out over the past year or two, and it's made a little bit of a change, a little bit of a dent in public consciousness, but I think we can all agree, not a whole lot. I mean, we've had a lot of other things going on this year, coronavirus, lockdown, and everything related to that, and now protest/riot spreading across the United States, and much of the world is in a state of unrest. We can see that a lot of the UFO news that has come out, that's legitimate, important news, has probably made less of a dent only because it's been overshadowed by so many other things. And it is entirely possible, I would say maybe even likely, that there's not going to be a rise in consciousness on this subject in the coming years, especially if there are no new major revelations that will come out, which again I think is entirely possible. It's entirely possible. Meanwhile, we're moving into an era where increasingly everyone is attached to their phone. Everyone is living more and more of their lives digitally, virtually, it seems to me, as opposed to in real life, the real world. And what that means is that each of us is more inclined to be living in our own little bubble of our own universe with the ideas and news that we are looking for and we're surrounded by. And for a lot of folks, like if they're not keyed into the UFO subject, it's very possible that they won't ever be keyed into it unless something really huge and major happens, which that can always be a game changer. But again, it's entirely possible that there won't be any major game-changing events that occur. And frankly, I think we are now in an era where we may be lurching from crisis to crisis for a while. We've got in the U.S. an election coming up in just 2 months. And good Lord, everyone on the left and the right is terrified, I think, of what may come out as a result of that. We might have some serious unrest in the U.S. no matter who wins that election. So I think we're going to be in a state of, and then of course there's the whole economic situation. Everyone is waiting for the other shoe to drop on that, i.e. spiraling economic downturn that takes us from bad to worse. I mean, I've been looking at some of these prepper sites, Tracy particularly, and yeah, you can't just go by what the preppers are saying because, sure, they are some of the more, they might be more inclined to look at the negatives than ordinary other people. Even so, there's a lot of nervousness out there. There's a lot of people now in this world who are waiting for things to get much, much worse. economically. And that's entirely possible. We all know this. Everyone who's studied any global finance and economics realizes we are primed for things to go much worse economically, financially in 2021. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's entirely possible. So my point is that relating to the UFO news, that can be relegated to the back for a long time to come. And it could be seen, at least in terms of the larger consciousness, as irrelevant compared with the other things that are going on, which is everything having to do with the pandemic, everything having to do with the U.S. elections, everything having to do with the global economy, everything having to do with greater and greater levels of control over our world, both digitally and in real life. All of those things easily could be taking precedence over UFO consciousness in the general public. So again, let me circle back around to where I started, which is, are we at the end of the era of just straightforward UFO reporting and analysis? I think, in a sense, yes. Not entirely. I think that there will remain an important place for genuine analysis of extraordinary aerial objects. I'm not saying we want to stop that. In fact, we don't want to stop that. But I am saying that that is really only going to be one piece of a much larger panoply of options for us moving ahead into the future. Those options, again, should be including the fight for government transparency of all governments, even those who claim that they've been transparent, like the UK government, which has pretended that they're transparent on UFOs, and they're definitely not. But all government transparency, US and others. It seems to me that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there because there's a lot of evidence that undoubtedly exists. So that's one. Inside whistleblowers, leakers, with the proviso that they actually can be vetted, that would be important. Double down research into things like implants, into abductions in general, into new technologies. Golly, I didn't even mention Bob McGuire's amazing project, Skyhub, which is an incredible idea and hopefully soon to be a reality of a way to obtain data on UAP around the world in a really original, unique way. So there's new technologies that we can hope and expect that will come online to allow us to engage this phenomenon in ways that are still creative. So we still want to be able to do that, but there is definitely the other side of this in which we're going to need to be out of the box, as it were, in order to get the evidence that we're going to want to indicate that there are genuine anomalies going on in our civilization. It seems to me moving the ball to some extent from like a focus on UAP/UFO, that remains important, but there's going to be other areas that we need to be looking at. Can't believe I almost forgot to mention Skyhub. What a cool and great and brilliant idea. And folks like Bob McGuire, who are pushing that, really need to be supported and commended for the incredible work that they're doing, because it's that type of creative research that will keep this field fresh. But the clock is ticking. How much time we are really going to have to make a genuine breakthrough so that our society can openly discuss deep, penetrating information about the UFO subject in all of its ramifications. We're still not there. It seems to me we're not going to get there until we get a genuine acknowledgement of a long-standing covering up of information. I think we have to start there. We haven't gotten there. Even in these last 3 years, we're still not even close. acknowledging a cover-up is critical because that's when the public finally gets an admission that they've been lied to. And you realize, like, we're just not there. Everyone's dancing around the obvious to avoid looking at that plain fact that the government and the intelligence community has dominated the information on this subject for so long. They've been able to lie to the public for generations and generations. And you can see they don't want to look at the implications of an entire lifetime of deception and secrecy on a subject that for all those years got ridiculed, dismissed, pushed to the side in the most snarky, nasty ways at times, gaslighting the public for years and years and years. And now, it's starting to come out, and you can see there's a tremendous hesitancy, more than a hesitancy, a complete unwillingness to go into that issue. The simple fact that we've been lied to. And I think we can all understand why, because it's a very explosive subject to discuss, but also very important. Because honestly, we can't really deal as a society with the phenomenon in all of its ramifications if we don't first come clean with our government. If our government doesn't come clean with us, I should say, and to tell us what it knows, at least in essentials, about what is happening with this phenomenon. I don't see how we can progress without prying that lid open. Well, this has been an unusual weekly Fireside Chat. It started out, actually, Tracy and I were just talking about it being a nice little off the cuff. But I think it's an appropriate Fireside Chat podcast, just because we've got a fairly coherent theme here. And it's something that I think is important for our field. Really, what is the future direction of ufology in the world that we are now living in? What is the purpose of ufology? I have a feeling this provisional podcast is something that it will be worth coming back to in a more formal way, maybe even with genuine proposals and more fleshed out ideas. But for right now, this is a start, and I'll definitely be interested in hearing your opinions on this in your comments below here and also on the forum. So that's it for now. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. It's hopefully this wasn't too disjointed. I did a lot of pausing and restarting in the course of this one, and I think that the thoughts were pretty coherent, but in retrospect, hopefully when people are listening, they'll agree that, yeah, we moved along pretty well. We'll see. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed it, and we'll definitely catch you again soon. Bye for now.